first I'd like to thank ILSI for putting this session together and say what an honor it is to be part of this distinguished panel of speakers. I'd also like to thank David Allison for the touching and kind remarks about John Milner. He's a dear friend of mine and was involved in the early planning stages of this program today, and he called me one day and said in that loud voice, "Regan, this could be really boring. You better not make it boring." So I will do my best not to make it boring. But if it is, I would like to also implicate my partners in crime in this series of papers, Vic Fulgoni, Deborah Keese, Louise Berner, and Johanna Dwyer. So I oftentimes start talks on fortification by showing this slide, which shows that there is really a risk at both sides of the intake distribution. We often talk about people not getting enough, but we also have to be concerned about people getting too much of nutrients. And so most of the data that I will be presenting today are at those intakes at the tails of the distribution, and that is below the EAR and above the UL. And you can see here that there is quite a considerable gap here between the RDA and UL in this schematic, but that's not necessarily the case for all nutrients. They're not necessarily, particularly for children, the distance between the EAR, the RDA, and the UL isn't necessarily this nice wide spread here. So before we characterize diets as being inadequate or excessive, we want to make sure we're looking at usual intakes before we look at the prevalence of inadequacies or excessive nutrient intakes. And what I mean by usual dietary intake is the average or long-run intakes over a specified period of time. And we'll be talking about that in the context today of population monitoring and surveillance, because, of course, dietary recommendations are intended to be met over time. You don't necessarily have to have the recommendation every single day or you will be inadequate. But your long-run average intake is what we're interested in. The problem is that usual intake distributions are not directly observable. We have self-reported dietary assessment methods that we know measure usual intake with error, and if this is ignored, we can have bias. However, there are statistical modeling methods that can be used to correct this bias by removing the within-person variation and also including what we call nuisance effects, so things like day of the week, recall sequence, and interview mode, which affect reported intake. So I'm going to show you some data today on toddlers, children's, adolescents, and teens in the US, and I will use the word children to represent all these wide variations in age. And I have a 2-year-old and a 17-year-old, so I know that the word children wouldn't really apply to either one of those age groups, but nevertheless, this is what we're going to be looking at. So we'll be looking at data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey through the years 2003 through 2006, during which time we had 2 24-hour dietary recalls available to us. One was in person, one was over the telephone. The NCI method was used to estimate the usual intake distributions. Supplement use was recorded via a 30-day frequency questionnaire, which is assessed in the home of participants. A special database needed to be constructed to determine the source of the nutrients. The existing databases don't necessarily have added nutrients versus intrinsic nutrients, so this was a real labor of love that Deborah Keese constructed a specific database so that we could answer some of these questions. And Louise Berner also looked at the ranked food sources for added nutrients, which I'll be presenting today. So you've seen this slide from Vic Fulgoni's paper a number of times in different contexts here today. So this is the prevalence of intakes below the EAR. In red here, I'm showing you if these were just naturally occurring, so we would have a rather high proportion for some of the vitamins demonstrated in this slide. We see that this is dramatically lowered for the enrichment nutrients here, and then when we further incorporate dietary supplements, we see for some nutrients this makes an impact at lowering the prevalence below the EAR. Looking at minerals, we see a slightly different story than vitamins because there is not as much added minerals as vitamins in the U.S. food supply. And then further looking at dietary supplements, we see the most impact here for iron and for zinc. So to summarize those two slides, fortification shifted the percent of the EAR noticeably lower for vitamins A, D, B6, C, and the 5 enrichment nutrients, and zinc. There was a small or negligible shift in the percent below the EAR for E, calcium, and some other minerals. And with the exceptions of vitamin D and vitamin E, dietary supplement use had relatively little impact in lowering the EAR. But there's two sides to every story. So when we're looking at a distribution and we're looking at fortification, as was alluded to earlier by a number of speakers, fortification shifts everybody in the distribution, and it's not necessarily in a uniform way, as Chris Taylor alluded to. Those who have high intakes before fortification of a nutrient may have slightly different or higher intakes than once a fortification occurs. And also, dietary supplements add substantially to those people who use them, but not everybody uses them. So that changes the distribution and the shape and the nature of that, and we'll explore that a little bit more. So in this slide, I'm presenting the percent of children who have usual intakes above the UL by dietary supplement use. So the darker purple is looking at children who don't use dietary supplements, the prevalence who are exceeding the UL. So you can see that that's considerable for some nutrients like zinc, but then when we look at the impact of dietary supplements is where we see a really big factor. I think it's important to note that no adults in the United States during these same time periods exceeded the UL from their foods alone, like we saw in children. And so the first question that people often ask me is, well, is this really a problem? Are intakes above the UL a problem? And I say, well, the answer to that question depends on who you're interested in looking at. And I have here a phrase we use in our office, lumping versus splitting. So everything I've presented today is lumping, okay? 2 to 18-year-olds, users and non-users of supplements, that's a big lumped group, and who does that really explain? And I'm going to show you next that when we start to split out some of these groups, that's where you see the real differences. So I'm going to tell you a tale of two nutrients, the first of which is folate. And so on this side of the slide will be the percent below the EAR. If we're looking at intrinsic only, this is the percent who would be considered inadequate. And I have for your reference up here the estimated average requirement by age group. And we see that with fortification, again, a dramatic lowering. Yay! That's the best of times. Now, when we look at that same impact at children exceeding the UL, for 2 to 8-year-olds, we now see that we have increased dietary intakes to nearly 10%. And with supplements, we see a much greater impact. So if you like slides with words instead of slides with pictures, I put this up here to just summarize that before fortification, half to all of children had intakes that were below the EAR, but after fortification, about 10% of children exceeded the UL just from their food sources, and 70% of children who use supplements exceeded the UL. So now let's look at zinc. This is the percent below the EAR for intrinsic nutrients and when we have added nutrients. What's really interesting to me, however, though, is the percent of children exceeding the UL for zinc. 45% of children from their foods alone, which increases to 84% when we look at dietary supplement use. So that was showing data by splitting. Now we're going back to lumping 2 to 8-year-olds. So this would be, you cannot exceed the UL from folate, only from folic acid. So naturally occurring folate isn't factored in for the UL. But when we look at folic acid, again, it's around 10%, and then this 30% then represents the average of users and non-users. Same thing here with zinc. Intrinsic, 24%. added nutrients 45%, and with supplements about 53%. So Louise Berner put this slide together, and if we wanted to know overall for certain vitamins and minerals, what percent of children's diets are coming from added nutrients? Well, for vitamin D, thiamine, and folate, 50% or more of their sources are from added nutrients to food. About 20% to almost half added nutrients coming from vitamin A, C, B12, B6, and the other enrichment nutrients. 12 to 18% for zinc, and negligible amounts for other micronutrients. I was interested in looking at the percent contribution for nutrients by age group to see if it really made much of a difference. And I tried to break this down as much as possible to show where nutrients are coming from. So in the diets of 2 to 3-year-olds, about 40% of their folate is from added sources, with an even distribution between fortification and enrichment. This increases to 50% among 4 to 8-year-olds, with again an even split, 25-25, and we see that the percent from enrichment increases slightly for 9 to 13-year-olds, and then increases again for 14 to 18-year-olds. The biggest contributor of food sources to added folate or folic acid and zinc is ready-to-eat cereals, and you can see that almost exclusively for zinc it's ready-to-eat cereals. But for folic acid, also contributed by breads and rolls, pizza, pasta, cakes, cookies, and pastries, representing nearly 75% of the added folic acid in the diets of our children. I always want to bring this back to the context of dietary supplements because fortification adds to the intakes of nearly everyone, but a third of children take dietary supplements and half of adults do. So they're also receiving nutrients from this source. So we looked at the intakes of various vitamins and minerals by dietary supplement use, and for non-users is in purple and for users in blue, and you can see that among 2 to 8-year-olds the difference is in the percent below the EAR. What was interesting though is dietary supplement use really didn't have an impact on inadequacies for a number of nutrients listed here because there was 0% inadequacy to begin with before the consideration of dietary supplements. For children 9 to 13, we see there are a few more significant differences between vitamins and minerals between users and non-users. But again, there was less than 1% inadequacies in iron, B12, selenium, and less than 2 to 3% for copper, folate, and B6 before the use of supplements. So diets are pretty similar with these nutrients. But even with the use of dietary supplements, calcium and vitamin D intakes remain low in this age children. For our teenagers, I had to split it onto 2 slides because there were so many differences between users and non-users in this age group. And I'm not going to read these to you, but I'll show you the numbers. And these papers have all been published if you're interested in looking at the numbers a little bit more closely. So children had a much higher prevalence of inadequacies than younger children, older children did. Dietary supplement use is the lowest in this age group, but among those who use them, it really makes an impact. I did want to point out females 14 to 18-year-olds in the United States still have a number of nutrient challenges. And considering all sources of nutrients, you can see that more than half of children, females in this age group, and I know they're not children, but they're children to me. Vitamin A, D, E, calcium, magnesium, more than 50%, even with the use of dietary supplements, are failing to meet the EAR. Omar provided me a slide, and I wanted to just remind you that while we're worried about excessive intakes in our youngest children, worldwide we are really worried about inadequacies for a number of nutrients and different types of nutrients than we see in the United States. So to summarize what I've presented here today, fortification and enrichment reduces the prevalence of inadequacies for several nutrients in the diets of U.S. children and adolescents. But calcium and vitamin D remain a public health challenge, even among those children who use supplements. Females 14 to 18 years of age have the highest prevalence of inadequacies of all of our children. Added nutrients increase the proportion of children exceeding the UL from food sources alone. A reminder that fortification adds to the nutrient intakes of nearly everyone in the population, whereas dietary supplements add nutrients only to those who choose to use them and in considerable doses. Some future directions: I think we need to examine this type of work in different race and ethnic status in our country. I think we need to look at different socioeconomic status levels. We've primarily focused on age, gender groups, but I think it would be interesting to expand this work in different directions. We have extraordinarily limited data in birth to 24 months of age. We really have no idea of these intakes. I have data, better, faster, or more up to date. Chris Taylor made this point as well. We need analytically derived values for both foods and for supplements. I think maybe you can tell that Chris and I work together because we think the same about some things, but I do think we need to engage stakeholders to understand the importance of databases. People think that they're not very interesting or sexy, I guess, but this is what is the linchpin of all of the data that we're presenting are the databases, and so I think there's a real need to focus there. You can call me a dreamer. I've been called a lot worse, so it won't hurt my feelings. But I think we need innovative strategies to incorporate dietary supplements, diet, and biomarkers all together to look at status. I don't think we just want to look at biomarkers and status. I think we need to look at all sources of nutrients and to determine someone's status. And I think we may wish to revisit the DRIs for children when and if new data are available. So I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.